Allow me to greet you with the words that the Apostle John wrote to an early church in 2nd John chapter 1, or the only chapter. Grace and mercy and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father Son, in truth and in love. Well, the passage for this morning is from John, the Gospel of John 11. And it is the seventh sign of 7 signs in the book of John that reveal for us who Jesus is and why he came. And it even points to what comes next. What comes next for Jesus? What comes next for us? What comes next for all of creation? And I would encourage you just to read through chapter 11 of John. It's a really compelling narrative. The narrative starts, this story about Lazarus starts and finishes with this looming threat to Jesus' life, that the more he does, the more he heals, and the more he frees, and the more he forgives, the more opposition he also receives. It's getting more dangerous for him. And he shares that he intends to go to Lazarus, and his disciples say, if you do, you might die. And interestingly, Thomas, in chapter 11, I encourage you to read it for yourself, Thomas says, well, let's go with him then, that we might die also. We usually think of Thomas as doubting Thomas, but here he's not doubting at all. I think sometimes we give Thomas a little bit of a tough time with that name. Thomas is ready to die. The story about Lazarus ends with the Jewish leaders planning out his death. And so in this passage we see Jesus will be providing a life for a life. His life for Lazarus' life is what looks like it will likely happen. There's a lot of parts of this passage that are really interesting. Jesus' decision to wait. Jesus is weeping at the tomb. He fully enters the human experience. He doesn't stand far off. Jesus is not showing us a God who is far off, like a spy in the sky, looking down on us disapprovingly. That's not what Jesus is showing. Jesus is showing us a God who fully enters our experience, experiences our suffering and pain with us. Isaiah speaks of this vocation of Jesus as the suffering servant, that he came to take on the suffering of the world. Let's read a passage here in John 11. I'll read it with you, and then you can read the entire of John 11 on your own if you would like. At this point, Jesus has waited so that his disciples and all around might see the 7th of the signs, a fuller revealing of his glory, see what's possible in God. He's come to the tomb, and Mary and Martha and those around him say, you could have helped. They have faith, but partial. Faith is a process. Our faith is never perfect. We're always in process. And then here it says in 38, then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb, and it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, take away the stone. And Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, already there is a stench, because it has been 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you would always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said, "Unbind him and let him go." As I mentioned, this is the seventh sign of seven signs in John that disclose for us who Jesus is and why he came and what his nature is. And these seven signs are really following up or adding to the way the book of John started in the beginning. In that first verses of John, the writer's letting you know, I'm telling you a new story of creation, a renewal of creation, a making of all things new. And these seven signs broadly, not specifically, but broadly correlate to the 7 days of creation. Now, in the 7 days of creation, God forms order. He calls light. He separates the sky and the water in, below. He creates dry land. And as soon as he creates the order almost, life just starts to flourish from his hand, from his voice. Vegetation springs over all the earth. He commands animals and life in the sea, humankind. So he's created a structure, and he's fostered the explosion almost of life, abundant life. But it had been a long time since the garden and the original creation by the time John writes his gospel. The garden's gone. Or they couldn't return there, at least. And there's much suffering and sickness and pain. And Paul says all creation groans for redemption. It's not just that we're hurting. The environment's hurting, is what Paul said in Romans. It groans to be redeemed. And so in John, Jesus is starting that work. And his first sign discloses for us how it's going to happen. It's going to be very personal and very loving and very powerful. He's going to start not by redeeming from afar, not by reordering things from heaven. He comes down to earth and is working it out person to person in the small details of our lives. That's his plan for redemption, to start in the human life, in the lived experiences, the small details. And so he starts with a young couple who are suffering from a lack of resources. And he provides a wonderful, joyous wedding for them. Next, he heals a man's son, the second sign in chapter 4. And the third sign in chapter 5, he heals a man who had been lame for 38 years. And the fourth sign in chapter 6, he multiplies the loaves in the midst of scarcity. God provides enough for all. That's a sign of his new work. In chapter 5, or rather in chapter 6, he calms the sea. It's like as if the sea is reflecting the opposition that's rising up to meet Jesus. It's in some ways metaphorically illustrating that. He calms the sea, but that opposition is still rising. And so when he heals the man born blind in chapter 9, what we covered last week, we see that this road for Jesus looks like it leads to death. And then finally, the seventh sign, again, Jesus provides his life for a life. You can really see by chapter 11 that to do this public act, this greatest miracle of Jesus so far in front of people, will cost him his life. Jesus waited until the fourth day, and at that time it was traditionally thought that for 3 days the spirit might hover around the body, but on the fourth day it was gone. And there's no hope. And by waiting, Jesus reminds us that when we think there's no hope, there is. There seemed to be no hope for Lazarus. That's what Martha thought. She's like, Lord, by now there is a bad smell. Decay has already set in. But when Jesus comes to make things new, nothing can stop him. It says here, Jesus wept. He, again, fully enters the human experience. Now, some of us are quite uncomfortable or avoid suffering. And at our worst, as humans, we'll take our suffering out on others, like Cain took his troubled relationship with God out on his brother. That's a theme in American history. When people suffer and they don't deal with it well, they'll take it out on someone else. The closest person, the closest people group nearby. And what we see with Jesus is he suffers and he takes it onto himself, and he doesn't extend it or take it out on others. He takes it on, allows it to do its worst, and overcomes it by the power of God. Again, when we think that there's no hope, there is, because Jesus fully enters the human experience, knows what we're going through, understands this life that we live, and offers to lead us to a new place with him. John 11 presents something even worse than Cain killing Abel. It's now the people of God, the children of God, turn on God's own Son. And you might also think that there's no hope for those of us who have betrayed Jesus, or those of us who have failed him. I mean, this whole notion that they are missing the time of their great visitation. God's walking the earth again like he did in Genesis 1 and 2. And they're missing that. And not only they're missing that, they're going to plan to kill him. It's tragic. But the raising of Lazarus points towards something even greater. When we think that nothing greater can happen, that God has done his best, there's even more. The raising of Lazarus points towards Jesus' own resurrection. And that resurrection is a first sign, a first won battle in Jesus' bigger job of redeeming all creation, making all things new. And he says, I need to start with humans. If humans were the start of the fall, if they're the ones that messed all this stuff up, I'm going to start with them and their hearts. And that's what he's doing now. By loving us, by the reading of the word, by the prayers of the saints, by worship, he starts to renew us. But he doesn't stop with us. He's going to remake all things. We're just the beginning, the first sign to those around us that Jesus has not finished. Again, when we think that nothing greater can happen, there's much, much more. Well, this is the message of some of the message of John 11. I just encourage you to take some time to read it. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord let his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, to him be the glory and the honor and the power forever and ever. Amen. God bless you.